Okay, good morning, everybody. We now have a chance to hear some presentations from current USAFA cadets. These are all cadets who have either taken Major Gruner's Space Law course or are part of the Space Policy Club that we have here at the Academy. We're going to have two presentations here this morning, each about 20 minutes long to include questions. And then please keep in mind that we'll also have three presentations over the lunch hour as well. Our first presentation will be from Cadet Second Class, Taylor Belyeu. Taylor is from Umatilla, Florida, and is a data science major with a minor in space warfighting. Over to you, Taylor.
Thank you very much. Today, I'm going to be talking to you all about critical space infrastructure. This was actually a project that NATO met up with us and asked us as a cadet group to talk about and to discuss. So, overview of what I'll be covering. We're going to look at a background since this is with a NATO project. We're going to be looking at both the US and the EU's position on critical infrastructure in space. Then we're going to be looking at some of the issues that we've seen come up in terms of how critical infrastructure in space is viewed. Next, we're going to look at what we're doing in terms of what we're saying is an issue or what we're trying to research on this subject, and finally some of the complications that we expect to arise from our research. All right, so this is background for the US specifically. Definition of critical infrastructure is the assets, systems, facilities, networks, and other elements that society relies on to maintain national security, economic vitality, public health, and safety. So essentially, the things that are most important in terms of national security, in terms of making sure economics is safe, making sure society is safe. That's what critical infrastructure is. This was originally created in 1996. President Clinton signed an executive order to create critical infrastructure sectors. At this moment in time, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. That includes things like water, nuclear power, financial services, etc. To clarify, when we're talking about an infrastructure sector being critical, we're not necessarily talking about every part of that sector. So for instance, we're talking about specific areas that are important to national security or specific areas that are important to the economy. So it's not necessarily everything that's encompassed in that sector, but it's certain aspects within each sector. Now, finally, and most importantly, no aspect of space or space assets are considered critical infrastructure at this time in the United States. It's not a critical infrastructure sector. Moving on to the EU, this definition of critical infrastructure is slightly different because the European Union involves multiple states. So as you can see up here on the first bullet, it's talking about what would have a significant impact on at least 2 member states. This was actually created in 2008, so slightly later by the European Council. A definition of what they discuss as being critical here on bullet 3, talking about how damage or destruction to critical infrastructures could have very negative consequences on security, on well-being of its citizens, and that's why it's important, and that's why they play a vital role. For the EU, one of the biggest differences between the EU and the US is that space is labeled as a critical infrastructure. However, they don't delve much into depth on what they're talking about in terms of what space assets are critical infrastructure or ideas such as deterrence or protection. For instance, much of what the EU talks about is in terms of space weather, whereas there's a lot more that needs to be considered when it comes to critical infrastructure of space. All right, so moving on to some of the issues. So starting off with the US, again, no aspect of space or space assets are determined to be critical infrastructure at this time. Here's several reasons why this is a problem. Many space systems are critical to our national security and to our way of life and to our society. We use a lot of communications, from communication satellites to GPS capabilities, positioning, navigation, and timing that are very crucial to our defense and to our military. And those are critical. There's not enough emphasis or priority placed on these systems. So in terms of prioritizing budget measures with critical infrastructure, space is not considered critical infrastructure. It may not get the priority that it needs. Not enough information shared between these systems. One of the biggest reasons why critical infrastructure sectors are so important is because of the priority placed on sharing information between those systems to determine what we need to focus on, what deterrence measures we need, what protection measures we need, et cetera. So that's especially important in space since it's just growing in importance, and with it not being a critical infrastructure sector, that could pose problems. And then let's focus on potential hazards, deterrence, and defense of these systems. Again, the focus remains on the sectors that are considered critical. Without space being a critical sector, then there's less emphasis and less importance on it than there should be. All right, moving on to the EU. Since the EU does consider space critical infrastructure, it has its own set of problems, mainly that it hasn't got clear definitions or clear ideas on what space assets that we're looking at in terms of critical infrastructure, or how to deter or how to protect those critical infrastructures. So there needs to be a focus on definitions. There needs to be a focus on specifics in terms of critical infrastructure in space. There needs to be a focus on how to protect that. And there needs to be a focus on deterrence measures as well. All right, so that's mainly the background. So going into what we're working on in terms of this project, we have 3 lines of effort. First, research. So researching more into what exactly is considered critical infrastructure, what should be considered critical infrastructure in space, and why that would be important. Next, we're looking at exploring aspects of deterrence. So for instance, with the EU only looking at space weather as an area of conflict or an area that's an issue, we would need to look more into things like ASATs, as was mentioned on the last slide, or ways that Russia or China maybe would try to attack our critical infrastructure in space. And finally, explore instruments of national power. So we would look at areas like diplomacy, economics, information, military, and look at how they're integrated into our space infrastructure and how they rely on space as well. All right, so some areas that we would consider to be more difficult in terms of our research. Relatively unexplored aspects of space. So we also want to look into the future of space and space warfighting to see what may be important considerations. For instance, mining on celestial bodies, if that would have any impact on what we consider to be critical space assets in the future. Differences between government-owned and privately owned assets, whether or not that would impact our ability to protect or deter enemies from attacking those assets. For instance, right now we could see Starlink is especially critical in the Ukraine. Would that impact of it being from a private company have any determinants we protect from that? Deterrence practices could have unintended consequences. So we need to look at what our practices could result in. So obviously the world is very interconnected, especially in space. So if we implement a deterrence practice in space, what are the possible consequences, retaliation that could occur from that, or even the formation of customary law should multiple other nations join us in those practices? All right, and finally, the far-reaching consequences in terms of space being very integrated in what we do on the ground, and whether or not what we do in space could have long-term or just have impacts on our capabilities on the ground. All right, so some tentative conclusions right now. First off, for the US, definitely space infrastructure should be made the 17th sector of critical infrastructure. That's the biggest thing that we would draw from the US, considering that there is nothing on space right now. And then defense and deterrence, we would need to focus not only on defensive capabilities, but also possibly offensive capabilities in the future in order to protect and defend our satellites. For the EU, they already have space infrastructure technically, but we need to grow in those defense assets and specifically look at how to deter aggression, because that's not something that they've been looking at up until this point. Next, we would need to look at ground station, for instance, vulnerabilities. We need to consider how space is interconnected to the ground as well, and consider how we protect the assets on the ground that are necessary for missions in space. And finally, because it's the EU, we would need to look at ways that the group as a whole or multiple nations could provide deterrence or provide protection within the EU. And finally, in terms of both the US and the EU, critical assets would include things like GPS, positioning, navigation, timing, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and communications capabilities. Those would be critical assets for both very clearly. Cyber defense, space is very integral in terms of cyber capabilities and cyber defense. Much of what we do has cyber involved with it, so not protecting in that area could cause difficulties in our missions in space and our ability to protect those assets. So there needs to be a special emphasis on cyber defense as well. And finally, we need to consider what Russia or China or any of our other enemies may do depending on what we enact in space, whether it be customary law, whether it be some kind of deterrence, or anything of that effect. We need to be aware of what kind of responses may come from that. All right, are there any questions?
Excellent presentation, by the way, really informative. Well done. So one of the things about critical infrastructure, whether you're talking about dams or power plants or chemical plants, one of the things we do is we regulate those because they're critical infrastructure. But there's a hesitancy to regulate space, and that may also be one of the reasons why it's not been declared a critical infrastructure. So if we do declare it, should we regulate it, and how? And I know that's not an easy question.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's definitely a very difficult question. I would say at this point in time, because space is still developing, probably regulation wouldn't be necessary or wouldn't be as all out as it is in maybe other sectors until we've fully developed capabilities in space. So as I mentioned before, we need to consider what may happen in the future in terms of, will companies be mining resources from celestial bodies? That isn't something that's happening now. So because space is still kind of a growing sector in terms of what's going to happen in there, regulation would probably need to wait for the most part.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. And actually, I think you've already answered my question, but I'll ask it again in a different way anyway. It was about, you've obviously concluded that the US should look at space as a critical infrastructure. Do you have any sort of sense in your research as to why up until now that's not been done, or whether it's just not been considered, or whether it's been considered and discounted? Do you have any sense of that?
So from what I've gathered, the critical infrastructures were created in 1996. There hasn't been any update in terms of new critical infrastructure sectors since then. There have been a few updates. I think the latest one was in 2013 in terms of as information within those sectors, but there hasn't been an additional sector. So I don't think space was considered very highly when those sectors were created, and since then there hasn't been a creation of those sectors. There has been a push in terms of creating, making space a new critical sector. I don't think that's been from the government level. I think that's been from more of a private entity level.
I have a question for you before we conclude. So in addition to the domestic regulation questions that result from a declaration of a sector being part of critical infrastructure, it also, I think, changes our relationship vis-a-vis other states and how we might respond towards aggressive action towards critical infrastructure. Have you thought in your research about how that might change our posture, or how we might react to different actions by other states in outer space should it be declared critical infrastructure?
In terms of how we would react, we haven't quite gone into depth on the specifics of how we might react. We've looked more broadly in terms of what we need to protect, and in terms of looking into deterrence measures and looking into what may be the unintended consequences of those measures. We haven't looked into specific policies in terms of what those deterrence measures may be.
Would you see it something kind of on par with nuclear command and control, or maybe at a more reduced level in terms of how we might respond towards actions against that sector?
Well, I think the way we would respond would depend on what kind of attack we're experiencing. For instance, a cyber attack may warrant a cyber attack in return. I don't think we would want to escalate it to too high of a level, as that may cause more problems rather than resolving the issue.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? All right, please join me in a round of applause. Okay, for our second presentation today, we have Cadet Second Class Desmond Rodriguez. Desmond is from Washington, D.C. and is a space operations major. Over to you, Desmond.
Thank you, sir. As he said, I'm a space operations major with a French minor, and also in general, a bit of a space geek and Star Trek lover. Today, I'll be discussing planetary defense. It's a history, current policy and operations, and as well as the future of planetary defense. AWC, we already inputted our jobs for when we graduate, so hopefully I get space operations. Now, to preface this discussion, I like to think of planetary defense as the business of recording, tracking, and defending against near-Earth objects. Near-Earth objects being asteroids or comets within 28 million miles of the Earth that may pose a threat of impact. The history of near-Earth objects in planetary defense is a little vague. You can point back to the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, or you can look to more recent films such as Don't Look Up, which discuss the importance of worrying about issues such as planetary defense. One of the, I'd say the straw that really broke the camel's back in recent developments in planetary defense would be the Chelyabinsk meteor in Russia. And whether you've stumbled upon some old Russian dash cam videos or you've looked it up for yourself, you may have seen pictures such as this really bright object streaking through the sky and then exploding midair. Now, the Chelyabinsk meteorite was only about 19 meters across, but caused significant damage to buildings in the city, as well as minor injuries to folks living there. This occurred in 2013. And in 2014, the Inspector General of NASA came out with a review discussing the lack of consolidation of NASA resources for detecting and mitigating impacts from near-Earth objects. And from those results of the Inspector General came an organization called the PDCO, the Planetary Defense Coordination Office, run by a Mr. Lindley Johnson out in Washington, D.C. My notes are falling off the podium. Mr. Johnson's job now, as he still does it, is to consolidate all the different resources that NASA has to offer. There are a wide array of surveillance satellites and other far out tracking resources to observe the potential different near-Earth objects, all the way down to about half a meter, to larger ones such as the Chelyabinsk meteorite, or ones with a diameter of about 100 meters, which actually have the ability to enter the atmosphere and make it down and actually make an impact, unlike the Chelyabinsk meteorite. There are also developments, I'd say recently in the past 10 years on the international stage. Two of those organizations being the International International Asteroid Warning Network, which is a partnership between organizations such as the PDCO, ESA, other foreign space agencies, which actively discuss and monitor different asteroids, as well as one that Mr. Johnson aptly named Same Page, the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, which discusses a lot of international policy on what exactly can nations employ in terms of not exactly weapons, but devices to prevent impacts, as well as how can we all consolidate our materials in order to better track them. Currently, this is Mr. Johnson's organization within the PDCO. Obviously looks rather convoluted, all the different sections that he is coordinating with and he has to keep up with. You'll see a couple ones in there, such as DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, which I'll get into later, as well as some other large names, United States Space Force and their Space Surveillance Network. Currently, our capabilities are consolidated, and that's something that NASA did figure out, though it's a matter of managing all these different assets that both the government has, as well as that we're trying to collaborate with other nations in order to track and defend ourselves against these near-Earth objects. As I mentioned before, same page does exist, and they continuously output policy on near-Earth objects in the matters of planetary defense. They have cited sections of the Outer Space Treaty, stating that, including Articles 1, 2, and I'd like to say 52, on matters of collaboration with different states, stating that as a nation, with the capabilities of, such as the Space Surveillance Network and all the different observation satellites that NASA has, we in fact have an obligation to collaborate with other nations and use the resources that we have to prevent potential impacts, something that can really seriously have a negative impact, no meaning in that pun there, on other nation states. Now, I mentioned the Outer Space Treaty Article 4 in here, and in my research on the matters of planetary defense, it has come up multiple times. The one main matter is nuclear explosive devices and the matter of using, and the wording is a little delicate here, but nuclear weapons to mitigate and move asteroids away from impact trajectories of the Earth. The other is a little more interesting. And for those unfamiliar with Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, it discusses the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction, as well as nuclear weapons in orbit around the Earth. And there has been a bit of thinking into this. Can you describe this near-Earth object, this NEO, with an extremely hyperbolic trajectory around the Earth, as potentially a weapon of mass destruction? And if so, would that bring nation states such as the US to an obligation to actively defend ourselves as well as our allies from NEOs? That's still a consideration. The nuclear option, which I'll get into later, is a bit more obvious. Unfortunately, at the moment, and I say on the slide, we really focus on detection, tracking, response. At the moment, organizations such as NASA have detected over thousands of NEOs, ranging from 0.5 meter in size to many kilometers in size. If you think on a scale of how those might impact us, most meteorites around the size, most asteroids around the size of a meter just burn up in the atmosphere. You have an asteroid the size of the Chelyabinsk asteroid, which is approximately 19 meters in diameter, the force of a nuclear weapon exploding in the atmosphere. You then consider the scale of about 100 meters in diameter, which actually has the potential to impact the Earth. And you go to the asteroid that destroys the dinosaurs. There's no, I don't know how to others say this than fear-mongering, because it's definitely not fear-mongering because it's a relevant worry, but something such as that size, which is about 17 kilometers in diameter, they have been able to detect and track all these different sizes of asteroids. Unfortunately, the matter of response is still in development. There are NASA tests, such as DART, Double Asteroid Redirection Test, which launched November 24th of last year, which look at sending a satellite far out into a way off asteroid and hoping that a small change in delta V out there will have enough of an impact in that asteroid in order to push it off of an impact trajectory. In terms of future strategy and challenges, there's always a matter looking at future projects besides DART, and how do you develop legal and effective tools and weapons to mitigate the effects of asteroid impacts. There's also a look, as I said, with the matter of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. Can we find ways that we are mutually responsible for the defense of the Earth against asteroid impacts? One of the concerns that I found looking into my research is that with situations such as the double asteroid redirection test, assume that we develop that technology enough and it becomes an effective and manufactured system to defend the Earth against asteroids. What prevents that situation from being a matter of I think it's been a while since I've taken college level economy. I think tragedy of the commons, where all the nation states are relying off of a single one to defend them, where the United States becomes the sole national or international defender of the Earth and putting all of its resources rather than the resources of combined United Nations. That also brings up the point of responsibility of these threats intergovernmentally. Currently, the same page, that advisory group, is sponsored by COPUOS and the United Nations. However, they are not funded and they are a completely voluntary force, which means it is organizations such as the PDCO and folks such as Mr. Johnson of NASA who are putting their own time, effort, resources, and money into the matters of planetary defense. In the future, we see more funding put into that, whether by national organizations or the United Nations, and that remains to be seen. I mentioned this before. There are two different ways to mitigate an asteroid impact. The first one related to an asteroid redirection with the DART mission, and the other looks a little scary here with the pictures that I've chosen, but I've called it the nuclear option. And it's a little scary at first, I'd say, to consider sending a nuclear weapon up and blowing it up in space to destroy or change the delta V of an asteroid. But in cases where you consider the amount of asteroids and near-Earth objects that folks such at NASA have not yet detected, you may have one on an imminent impact trajectory to the Earth and have very little time to deal with it or to redirect it. And in that case, you will need the energy combined in a nuclear weapon, or as it's less violently called in the matters of planetary defense, nuclear explosive device. Only that will have the ability to create enough delta V to either redirect the asteroid or to fragment it to cause less danger to impacts to the Earth. I mentioned Article 4 before, which explicitly prohibits nuclear weapons in orbit around Earth. Now, doing some research, I found a paper by Professor Koplow from Georgetown Law, which he may be in the audience right now. I don't see him, but he is actually presenting later today. And he brought up an interesting point. Can you take a nuclear weapon, but recreate it and design it specifically for the matters of planetary defense? And in that case, because it's being rather than a tool of death and destruction, it is now a tool of redirecting foreign celestial bodies and is no longer technically classified as a nuclear weapon. It is still very hypothetical in nature. And I have another point on here, cooperation with foreign powers. I cannot imagine other international superpowers such as China or Russia agreeing to allow the United States to place nuclear explosive devices in orbit in order to defend ourselves against asteroid impacts. But currently, it is the only way to mitigate one of these attacks in a last moment situation. Same page does bring up a point that although it is explicitly prohibited in the Outer Space Treaty, and that any form of a nuclear weapon in space will require heavy compensation from the actors that put it there. In matters of extreme importance of self-preservation, there might be some justification for the nation state to place this nuclear weapon up in space for their own protection. That is difficult, of course, in the nature of planetary defense, these far-out objects trying to decipher not only their trajectory, whether or not they will actually hit the Earth, but where exactly they plan on impacting, what nation state will be effective, is very difficult to predict so early on. But that is something that hopefully contributes to the use of nuclear explosive devices, which are truly, current technology permitting an only option in that last minute situation. Now, what originally made me curious about this is, and obviously this seems a little elementary, but with a subject of planetary defense, that sounds much like a military job. In my research, I found that the majority of planetary defense is done by civilian space organizations, which is understandable. I think that you consider these adversary on adversary large armed forces are really focused on the matters on Earth, not to be worried about some minute concern of an asteroid hitting us. But there are actually many pros, a few cons, to organizations such as the Space Force or other international space military forces taking up the mantle on planetary defense. As you may have seen in my previous slide from the Planetary Defense Coordination Office, Mr. Johnson there relies on his small staff to cooperate between a wide array of national and international partners. But if you look at an organization such as the Space Force, which already has its own dedicated space surveillance network and other similar capabilities, it's a more clear, streamlined consolidation of all the resources to effectively detect, track, and defend against near-Earth objects. There is a concern if we are going to use a nuclear option in this situation. Clearly, I think our both adversaries and international allies would be more concerned with military organization employing nuclear explosive devices than a civilian organization. But regardless, these tools currently exist for the United States, and where are they located? But within the Department of the Air Force and Department of the Navy. And I did say before, the legality of these actions being done by a military body rather than a civilian body are definitely more conflicting. But I think that with the resources that a military organization such as the Space Force has, allows them to employ detection, tracking, and defense more effectively. Is it? Is there any questions?
With respect to Article 4, right, you talked about things that we've agreed to, or that is not in that framework of Article 4. Is that purposefully only a framework to get nation states on board with what should be in space? Or is there active enforcement or attempts to enforce that as things get pushed up into space? Are we looking at those things, or is it just laying the groundwork?
Well, that's a great question. And something that I've learned in my space law course with Major Gruner recently is that although most of our nations are pretty civil about abiding by the laws of the United Nations and COPUOS, which is this international organization underneath the United Nations which deals with space policy, there is very little to nothing to do with enforcement, unfortunately. And I think regardless of what laws are in place, it is very evident to us that even if COPUOS never had an agreement saying we will not put nuclear weapons in space, that simply that action would be enough to, I wouldn't say incite some retaliatory action from our adversaries, but even without laws in place, it would elicit an effect.
Okay, please join me in a round of applause. Cadet Rodriguez, thank you very much, Desmond. That was a very interesting presentation. Please accept this token of our appreciation.